Are we seeing the beginning of something that could completely change the 2026 Formula One season? Because after the Australian Grand Prix, there is a reaction that is attracting a lot of attention within the paddock. Nico Rosberg, world champion and one of the few drivers who really understands how Lewis Hamilton works when he begins to find his rhythm with a car, has admitted that what he is seeing has left him practically stunned. And it's not just about a fast lap or a good result on a difficult weekend. What has surprised Rosberg is something much deeper. The speed with which Hamilton is connecting with the Ferrari and how, almost without anyone noticing, he has begun to lap at a level very close to that of Charles Leclerc. For someone who knows perfectly well Hamilton's performance pattern when he begins to feel comfortable in a car, this is exactly the sign that can indicate that something very serious is beginning to form within Ferrari. And if this trend continues in the coming races, what we saw in Australia could be just the first warning of a much bigger story this season. To understand why Nico Rosberg reacted that way after the Australian Grand Prix, you first have to look at the full context of what was happening even before the weekend in Melbourne began. From Rosberg's analysis, the signs that are generating so much surprise today did not appear out of nowhere in Australia, but rather began to be built much earlier, specifically during the pre-season tests and the first performance references that were observed in Bahrain. There, analyzing data and on-track behavior, Rosberg began to detect a very specific change in the way Lewis Hamilton was driving the Ferrari. For someone who shared equipment with him for years and who knows perfectly well how his driving evolves when he begins to feel comfortable with a car, those small details are impossible to ignore. What Rosberg began to see was Hamilton's move from an adaptation phase to a control phase, a very specific point in any driver's process when he finally stops reacting to the car and begins to completely dominate it. That change may seem subtle to the average viewer, but in the technical analysis of Formula One it is a huge sign. Rosberg explains that when Hamilton is still adapting to a car, his driving often shows a lot of micro-corrections in the steering wheel, small constant adjustments to keep the car within the limit. Less clean braking or variations in the way you enter corners also appear because the driver is still discovering exactly where the car's true limit is. However, in Bahrain something completely different began to be observed. Those micro-corrections began to disappear, braking became much more precise and the car stopped surprising you at critical moments such as entering and exiting corners. That type of behavior indicates that the driver is no longer reacting to the car, but rather is anticipating exactly how it will respond. And when Hamilton reaches that level of synchronization with a single-seater, historically it becomes extremely difficult to beat. While that process was happening on Hamilton's side, within Ferrari there was another important factor that added even more complexity to the situation. Charles Leclerc had already shown in testing that he was still the driver with the most immediate connection to the car. A particularly fast lap in Sakir was interpreted by many analysts as a clear sign that the Monegasque was maintaining his status within the team, displaying impressive pure speed from the start of the project. But what Rosberg found most interesting was not that demonstration of speed in itself, but the parallel evolution that Hamilton was having with the same car. While Leclerc was already operating close to the car's limit, Hamilton seemed to be step by step building an increasingly solid relationship with the Ferrari, something that normally takes much more time for a driver arriving at a completely new team. When Ferrari finally arrived in Australia, those two lines of evolution began to meet at the same point. The Albert Park circuit offered a first real opportunity to measure the team's performance in full weekend conditions, with practice, qualifying and race sessions forcing the drivers to push the car to its actual racing limits. It was there that signs began to appear that caught the attention not only of Rosberg, but also of several people within the paddock itself. During the free practice sessions, different sources indicated that both the team boss, Frédéric Vasseur, and Leclerc himself were surprised by the pace that Hamilton was showing very early in the weekend. The data indicated that the Briton was beginning to replicate certain key elements of Leclerc's driving style, something especially important because the Ferrari seemed to require a very specific technique to be competitive on that circuit. One of the most revealing aspects was the way both drivers were attacking the fast corners of the Australian layout. The Ferrari displayed a very stable rear end, allowing the drivers to engage with more confidence when entering those high-speed areas. In Formula One, when the rear of the car transmits that stability, drivers can maintain a higher minimum speed when cornering without fear of the car suddenly losing balance. That is exactly what began to be observed in Melbourne. Both Leclerc and Hamilton could attack those sections with great confidence, something that normally only happens when the driver has a very clear connection with the aerodynamic behavior of the car. And what was most striking for Rosberg was that Hamilton seemed to be reaching that level of comfort much sooner than most expected. This is where the real reason why Rosberg uses the word stunned to describe what he is seeing comes into play. It's not that Hamilton was simply fast in a session or that Ferrari showed good pace at a specific moment. What really surprises you is the trend that begins to form when you look at all these pieces together. Hamilton is entering a control phase with the car much earlier than expected, while Leclerc remains extremely fast with the same car. When two drivers of that level begin to extract performance from the same car at the same time, the team's potential can grow exponentially because both push technical development in the same direction and force each other to raise their performance in each session. For Rosberg, who lived through Hamilton's evolution within Mercedes for years, that is exactly the kind of signal that should never be ignored. He knows perfectly well that Hamilton's most dangerous moment is not when he is struggling to adapt to a car, but when he finally understands it completely. And based on his reading of what happened in Australia, that moment could be coming much sooner than anyone in the paddock imagined at the start of the season. After analyzing what happened during training and the first signs of Ferrari's performance, the Australian Grand Prix ended up leaving a much more complex message than it seemed at first glance. Because if one thing became clear in Melbourne, it is that the performance of the Italian team is still far from being perfect. But at the same time it left very interesting indications about the true potential that Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc can achieve when the car begins to function within its ideal window. For Nico Rosberg, that contrast between the final result and the signs that appeared over the weekend is precisely what makes Australia such a revealing moment at the start of the season. The race itself was extremely difficult for all teams. Changing conditions, strategic errors, and the difficulty in finding the exact moment of each decision ended up influencing much more than many expected before the weekend began. Ferrari, in fact, ended up paying for one of the most important strategic errors of the Grand Prix. During the race, a virtual safety car appeared, offering a perfect opportunity to make a pit stop, but the team decided to stay on the track waiting for a better window. That decision ended up having consequences when a second VSC appeared with the pit lane closed, completely ruining the strategy that Ferrari had initially planned. What could have been a much more direct fight for the leading positions ended up becoming a race of damage control for both drivers. Despite that mistake, there were moments within the race that reinforced precisely the reading that Rosberg was making about the team's potential. Charles Leclerc, for example, managed to put himself in the fight for the lead thanks to a very aggressive start and a solid pace during the first stages of the race. That initial performance showed that the Ferrari had enough speed to compete at least during certain phases against direct rivals. However, the subsequent development of the race ended up showing another reality that is also part of Rosberg's analysis. Ferrari still does not have the fastest car on the grid. According to the team's own statements, Mercedes seemed to have an advantage close to half a second depending on the configuration of the circuit during that weekend. This point is fundamental to understanding why Rosberg's analysis is so interesting. Because if Ferrari still does not have the dominant car in the championship and yet Hamilton and Leclerc are already showing such a competitive level of adaptation and performance, then the team's room for growth could be much greater than what the current results reflect. In other words, what happened in Australia could represent just a small sample of what Ferrari will be able to do as the car evolves throughout the season. For an observer like Rosberg, who analyzes Formula One from the perspective of a driver who has experienced this type of process within a championship team, that kind of trend is exactly what worries rivals the most. Another element that reinforces that feeling is the internal dynamic that is beginning to form between Hamilton and Leclerc. In many Formula One teams, the presence of two extremely competitive drivers can become an internal problem, generating tensions that end up affecting the overall performance of the team. However, what Rosberg perceives in this case is a different situation. Both drivers seem to be extracting performance from the car in complementary ways, learning from each other and constantly pushing the car's limits. Hamilton, for example, began to adopt certain traits of Leclerc's driving style to better suit the Ferrari, while Leclerc continues to leverage his prior knowledge of the car to maintain a very high-speed benchmark within the team. Therefore, from Rosberg's perspective, what happened in Australia should not be interpreted simply as the first chapter of the season, but as an early warning for the rest of the grid. Hamilton seems to be getting closer and closer to that point of total connection with the Ferrari, while Leclerc continues to demonstrate the pure speed that has made him one of the fastest drivers in the championship. If both end up simultaneously finding their best version within the same project, Ferrari could become a much more dangerous rival as the championship progresses. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.